Welcome back, everyone. In this module, we're going to talk about the penultimate deliverable from the skeleton plane, wireframes. First, let's make sure we all understand what a wireframe is. So what is a wireframe? We're going to be talking a lot about wireframes in the next 2 weeks. So it's quite important that everyone has a very good grasp of what a wireframe is and what the expectations of a wireframe are. A wireframe is a screen blueprint, a visual guide, a skeletal framework of a website, and the first steps in the design process. I often refer to wireframes as the blueprint of your website and refer to it metaphorically like I would creating a house. And when you build a house, you absolutely need plans. And those plans take the form of both a project plan and a blueprint. Without that combination, your house won't be built. A wireframe is very similar to that. If we combine the wireframes with a project plan, we'll get a better view of what will be part of our end product. We won't have an actual visual representation of what that final site will look like. Very similarly to how a blueprint for a house doesn't actually show you what the house will look like. But we'll get a description, an overview, a positioning that most people will understand. It is a visual guide in that it displays elements in the right place, in the right hierarchy. And it becomes that framework that guides the rest of our creation. And the reason why we refer to it as the first steps in the design process is because it's one of the first times that our client will see a visual representation of what will become of their project. So if we know what a wireframe is, let's discuss the purpose of a wireframe. It's to display the priority of the website's content, depict the features and functionality that you'll find on your site, visualize the business objectives that our client has. Those are the prime elements that guide our wireframe creation process. We want to display the content and the function that was agreed upon in the scope plane. We want to make sure we incorporate the objectives of both the user and the business from the strategy plane. And of course, we structure our skeleton based on the deliverables that we created in the structure plane. Last but not least, a wireframe directs creative ideas. While there are different scales of fidelity of wireframes, the wireframe will always be looked at as a framework that drives forward our creative production. Here's a good example of a low fidelity wireframe on the left and a high fidelity wireframe on the right. The low fidelity wireframe can sometimes start as a sketch on paper. In this case, that's what they're describing. Whereas a little more higher fidelity, which means more detail in your wireframes, can be done with software applications. Not to say that you can't add detail to a hand-drawn sketch of a wireframe, but it becomes a little easier to put typography and position elements a little bit more accurately when you use software. Many designers start by sketching out their ideas, first on paper with pencil, and then taking those ideas that they've drawn out and bringing them into digital planes like software applications shown here. That allows them to take their low fidelity ideas and create high fidelity representations in wireframes. In this example, we see our wireframe on the left juxtaposed against a mock-up on the right. There's not a lot of difference because the wireframe on the left is effectively a higher fidelity one. It follows some really good padding and margins, and the layout is very similar to what the end result is on the right. But the difference is that on the left, it's a basic black and white with some grayscale signifiers like those icons. And on the right, it's the full incorporation of the client's brand guide. Some clients prefer to wait until mockups to show external resources because it's a little bit easier to understand something that looks more tangibly like the end product. But the essential part of our UX process really rests in agreeing on the elements of a wireframe, the priority and hierarchy of those elements alone without the incorporation of brand elements. And here's another example of a wireframe versus a final mock. Not a huge amount of difference. The priority and hierarchy and positioning of elements is very similar, but what we see is the incorporation of color, the incorporation of typography, a slight difference in the positioning of some of the elements, but for the most part, it's a very close replication. A wireframe does not depict type, style, color, layout, or imagery. And let me get a little bit more specific here. A wireframe won't include your actual typography, so your actual fonts in the proper sizes and weights. It also won't include any color. And I can't stress that enough. A wireframe is best delivered in black, white, and grayscale. Now, when I refer to layout here, I mean exact pixel perfect layout. The juxtaposition of elements in the right place to describe priority and hierarchy is absolutely what a wireframe does. Also, your wireframe should not have any photography, final illustrations, or the exact iconography set that will be used in your final product. A wireframe does not depict explicit layout. This is important to highlight here again, especially on mobile devices. When we create a wireframe, we're not using exact typography or exact margins and padding or size of images, meaning that it won't fit exactly the same way in the same viewport. What we really need to understand is what comes first, second, third, fourth, and so on. The explicit layout, that pixel perfect representation, will come during visual design mocks. A wireframe should elicit immediate emotional feedback, raise questions, and provide insight. When you show a client wireframes, and they've been part of the process up to this point, they should immediately know what is wrong and what is right. They should be able to give you feedback, highlight specific things that were missing, and ultimately raise questions about your designs. This is the first visualization that a client will see of what will eventually be their final product. So make sure that you look back at all of the inputs from the strategy, scope, and structure plane as you approach creating this first iteration of wireframes. So that's your overview of what a wireframe is, and I hope that helps as we move through the rest of the modules in this week, the structure plane. We'll see you in the next module.